Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. As Byron mentioned, the title of this webinar is Resource Reallocation to Promote Community Integrated Employment and Other Community Integrated Services. So we have had a number of opportunities over the past year to talk about numerous aspects of transformation, many different things that go into helping an organization begin to transform itself to a employment first agency that believes that employment is possible for all people with the right supports and opportunities. And also, we've worked hard on coming in compliance with the settings rule to make sure that people are involved in their community in a meaningful way. One of the challenges of transformation, and obviously one of the biggest ones, is really the financial aspects of it. So we've been doing business one way for many, many, many years. And in the last couple of decades, we've begun to change the way we're doing business. And now that change is somewhat accelerated, given the fact that we are really looking, well, one, that we have a lot of opportunities right now to bring resources into the states and out to the providers to help facilitate change. But also we are looking at some deadlines with things like the settings rule. So the reality is there's not going to be tons of new money, everywhere in the system as we are making these changes. So to some degree, what we're challenged to do is look at the resources that we currently have and figure out whether we are using them the best way possible. So what resource reallocation means is just that, is looking at your current resources and evaluating whether you continue to use them in the best possible way, or if there are other ways that you need to reallocate the resources you have to promote things that you want to do that are different than what you have historically been doing. So to the question of whether it's necessary, it is absolutely going to be necessary, probably within every single organization. The kind of reallocation of resources that you do obviously is going to vary from agency to agency, but the fact that we're all going to have to make a good assessment of our current resources and determine how to best use them moving into the future is something that none of us will escape. That will be something that will affect all of us. So this picture captures sort of where we are now. We're got trains running on 2 tracks, and sometimes they're running on 2 tracks in different directions. And the reality is that we barely, most of us, barely had enough resources to run on 1 track, and now we're challenged to run on 2. So, what does that mean for us that we have these very significant financial resource challenges? So let's look a minute at how we have customarily provided services in our industry. We all know that generally speaking, services were more centralized. We did a lot of on-site contract work or other types of facility-based work, which we're still doing some of. We did a lot of facility-based pre-employment training. We also had our facility-based day-hab, which may or may not have included work or work preparation. And we have for some time had some community-based work, including individual placement and group placements like enclaves and work crews. So this is how we have historically looked. This is how services looked when I came into the field, and how they have remained in many ages up until today or up until recent times. Wrong direction. So we're evolving now. So things are changing, and this is what we're moving towards. Services more in the community, decreased time on or decreased amounts of on-site contract work or other types of facility-based work, a great increase in community-based pre-employment training, an increase in community-based skill building, and an increase and work in community integrated jobs and in customized jobs. So we have moved from that model where everything was pretty much emanating from the facility to a situation where we're very much more in the community. And so inevitably, it causes us to look at the resources we have and ask those questions about, are we using what we have in the best way possible to meet the new model of how services are being delivered? If you think about, for example, as I look at this list and I see community-based pre-employment training as one of the things we're heading towards. Again, if you look at WIOA and the mandates of it, it is very much oriented towards having youth who are transitioning out of school move more directly into community-based work, bypassing a lot of the facility-based pre-employment training and facility-based training or work training. So, we are having a whole generation of people heading towards us who want different things, have been trained for different things, and for whom laws and regulations like WIOA and the settings rule are pushing much more towards community. So we have to, obviously, we have to respond to those trends. So the impact of all this, obviously, is that our resources are very stretched, particularly in a time of transformation when you haven't quite let the old way of doing things go. You haven't quite fully gotten on board with the new way of doing things. So you're a little stretched between both of those activities. And as I said earlier, you barely have enough resources for one set of activities, and now you have two sets of activities competing for some of those same dollars. So, hang on. This is here's some of the resources I'll talk a little bit about that are different and are needed for community employment. First of all, the staffing ratios, as you've all experienced, I know by now, are very different for community than they are for facility. When I talk to providers who tell me that they're going out in groups of 8 individuals, even if they're going out with 2 staff, that's alarming because the whole objective of going out and being in the community is helping people be in a more normalized and natural environment. When we get groups of 8 people and then we add 2 staff and we have suddenly a group of 10 people, that is a crowd. That's not a few people being out in the community and exploring and developing relationships, etc. So we have to get to the adequate staffing ratios. And I believe firmly when we're talking about employment that we should be aiming for individual placement employment as the ultimate goal. And that employment being employment which we can fade out from at some point. That requires a certain level of staffing that's different than what you would require in a facility. We're also aiming towards community-based, meaningful involvement in our community. Any ratio that's above 1 to 4 certainly challenges us to be able to do that in a good way. So those staffing ratios are going to be one of the biggest price tag items that you're going to face. Getting to those proper ratios is critical. The other thing that we need is not just good job development staff. We need exceptionally good job development staff. Agencies, particularly those that are employment first agencies, rise and fall based on the quality of their job development staff. And I've seen many scenarios where someone gets bumped around in an agency and doesn't do very well in many different positions and then finally ends up as the job developer, which is probably the last person that you want to be your job developer. Job development is getting more sophisticated. The skill set is higher. The tactics and strategies of customized employment, which is what is going to get the most complex people into jobs, again, are very sophisticated. So we really have to be thinking about who are we getting for job development staff, what are we paying them, how are we rewarding them, and if they're doing a great job, how are we keeping them? We also, and people I think hate to hear this, but I do believe, I firmly believe, that everyone is going to eventually have to have a cloud-based electronic database system for record keeping and communication in the field. It is extremely difficult and expensive for staff to run back and forth from offices and other places to record needed data by hand, or to run paper products back and forth in the community. Billing information can get lost. Confidential information can get exposed. It's going to be very necessary, I think, for all agencies to find a way to have the cloud-based electronic database systems. Communication devices and systems are critical. In an agency like mine, which had no facilities, everyone had to have cell phones. Because we had the cloud-based systems, we had also had to have tablets or smartphones that would support those systems. There is a necessity for the sake of the staff there to support them, and also for the safety of the individuals, to have very clear ways of communicating and being instantly in touch with people as needed. Another cost that some people don't think of, and indeed it is a cost, is the reframing of policies and procedures from those that fit the circumstances of a facility to those that are would be responsive to circumstances in the community. So taking the time and having the expertise and the wherewithal to revamp policies and procedures is another expense and a resource that's needed, particularly for community integrated employment and meaningful community integration. Also, a huge cost that gets underestimated, and I'm guilty of this myself, so I can speak from my own experience. Staff who have been successful in one setting, like a facility-based setting, and now are being asked to transition to community-based settings, require retraining. It's not the same job. It's a different job. It's a job that should be for which the job description should be rewritten, because it has different responsibilities, but also it's important for that staff to be trained in a number of strategies that will be used in the community. Hang on, folks, I'm just making sure my computer is not going to run out of steam here. So there's that revamped staff training, and one place that was successful with my agency is when we got the cloud-based electronic data system. There was a lot of staff training that went in, helping staff being able to use those new devices and systems that I didn't account for, and I really ran into regret on that. So these are things, and it's not an exhaustive list, but some things that
Genni, the sound's a little muffled.
community. So what is also, oops, I'm sorry. Did you miss that last part?
Yeah, a little muffled.
Okay, I'm going to go back. I was just simply winding up saying that the revamped staff training is very important. I've made mistakes myself in underestimating the cost of that and underestimating the amount of training that folks would need. So don't make my mistake. Be sure that you are considering that. So what does all this mean? You know, we've got this change coming. We've got a certain amount of resources. We've got those resources stretched thin. We've got all kinds of new stuff that we're going to need to fund. What does this mean? Well, hopefully you don't look like this about now, but something has to give. You, as agencies, have to figure out what your priorities are, what monies you have, and how you're going to spend those to accomplish your current goals. So that means starting from the place of taking stock, knowing what your resources are, understanding what your expenses are. And something I've observed is over the past couple of years, states have gone from things like daily rates of service to increasingly going to smaller units of service, whether those be hours or even quarter hours of service. So it's really important to take a good look at the resources you have and understanding the current costs that you have as you are transitioning into a world that is much more difficult to budget for and much more difficult to track with and much more difficult to make sure that in fact you can have that you're not going to go in the red with. So, all of you have had an opportunity to complete a self-assessment that we gave you early in the game here. Part of that self-assessment is triggering you or guiding you towards looking at what all your resources are and understanding what your current costs are from all your areas of service delivery now. So, as you are looking at that, we're also planning for the future. And I think everyone in the project has developed at least a little initial transformation plan. And in doing that, you are beginning that process of planning for the future. You're beginning to say, where is it, this agency is going to go in the future. And inevitably, when you start planning for the future, you have to look at certain things. And I think many of the agencies have been involved in this kind of self-examination over the course of this year. We've been looking at what your values are. We've been asking ourselves, what's the vision for this agency? What will we look like in 5 years? Will we still be in the locations we're in, or will we possibly have transitioned elsewhere? Will we grow? Will we shrink? What is it we will be doing? Who will we be? What will we look like? And along with that, obviously, is examining your mission, because values, vision, and mission all come together to help you see what the path is to your future. What do you believe in? What is your mission? What are you going to look like in the future? And then, obviously, as a part of that, we've done the self-assessment, and hopefully many of you have done something like a SWOT analysis, which is looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. And as you have done that self-assessment or the SWOT analysis, you have begun to identify, what you need to do to move forward into the future. And that is your strategic plan or your transformation plan. And again, most of you have started with a simple plan with perhaps a half a dozen items or so on it. Or even if you don't have a formal plan, you have started activities like conducting pilots that will help you understand, what you're going to need for the future. So as you do your resource assessment, you're doing it relative to this vision for where you're going and what you're going to need. Inevitably, when you're doing a plan for the future, and this would be true in your personal life, it would be true in business, it would be true anywhere. If you have dreams or things that you're aiming for in the future, and you're trying to figure out how you're going to be able to accomplish that, then you have to sort of draw out a timeline. So if you were an agency, say, that was 100% facility-based and had in-house work at sub-minimum wage, and you had day have that was only in the building, and you said to yourself, well, who I want to be in the future, who we want to be as an agency, is we want to have, the vast majority of people working in the community. We want those in day have to be involved in their community in a meaningful way and contributing and learning things that will help them eventually get into employment. There are activities that will be associated with reaching those goals. And those activities are what are in your plans. So, and if I was, say, for example, I was going to really promote customized employment in my agency, I would start with, okay, are we educated? Do we all know what customized employment is? Have we identified staff that's going to get extensive training in that? Have we identified the managers who are going to be trained also, because they're going to need to know what their staff is trying to do so they can support them appropriately? Are we going to set up a pilot to do this? What does that pilot look like? And then I would put a time frame on all of those things, because that timeline is then going to tell me when I need what. So, for the pilot, I may need only a certain amount of resources, but then that pilot is going to give me more information about ultimately what resources it's going to require to expand upon that pilot. I'll have timelines for that, and I'll know when I need what resources. So it's just like planning for anything. You have a goal in the future, you have steps toward it, but there are resources needed for you to take each one of those steps. What are they, and where are you going to get those resources is what you really need to be focused on. We're challenged, and I know people are all in different places, but many of us are challenged, as I was saying before, at this particular point in time, because suddenly we are budgeting either in a new framework, or we're budgeting for activities that we don't have a lot of experience with. If I reflect back to my own agency and I think of when I first came there many years ago, we had a sheltered workshop and we had a day program. And I pretty much knew from year to year what my budget would look like for those two activities, because I had a lot of history of how it had looked in the past. All I had to really alter was some variables like attendance, or maybe some things around some contracts I was going to get. But it wasn't, it was relatively easy to do because I was generally just passing that budget on from year to year. Once the agency changed and we began doing much more work that was billed in smaller increments and was also provided outside of the facility, then it became far more difficult, particularly in the beginning when I didn't have experience providing those services. So that meant I was very much in a position of having to forecast into the future, predict my future costs and my resource requirements without a lot of history, without a lot of experience, without a lot of the information I was accustomed to having. Many of you will be in that position. And anyone that works with me knows I encourage you to do pilots. And the reason is that gives you an opportunity to see how much a service is going to cost, to understand the complexity of providing that service, to understand where there may be hours that can be billed versus hours that cannot be billed, and therefore your rates are going to have to capture some of that unbilled time because you're still paying your staff during that time. So it is complicated, and I think we are more challenged at this point in time than we've ever been to do very good homework and have very talented staff helping us budget, a forecast for our future and budget for the future. This is actually just what I was saying in the budgeting. It's more challenging because you have inadequate data to make the sound projections. You have to forecast the revenue and the expenses with your assumptions clearly documented. You have to think of it, and this is an important thing, so please hear me on this one. A problem I see people having, so be thoughtful about this, is if you had served someone, say, all day, every day in the facility, in the workshop, and so therefore you were billing all day for that person, and now that person gets a job in the community, and they're not working all day, they're working part day, and suddenly you're not billing all day for that person, you're billing for a part day. It's important to ask the question, are there other wraparound services that person needs that you could also provide so that you are able to maintain your staff capacity and you're able to bill for roughly an equivalent amount of hours a day? Now, be thoughtful about that, because you don't want to put people in services that they don't need. and that's not what I'm advocating. I'm simply saying, from a business perspective, look at the full array of needs of that person, and if there are different services you can provide to that person that you can weave together to provide for that person, then you will probably stay in pretty good stead. So what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. If I was supporting someone to work and they worked Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but on Tuesday and Thursday, lost my computer. Hang on a second. Hold please. I have a technical problem. I'll finish my description as I sign back in. If I had someone who worked 3 days a week, but they had other needs on other days, then I could provide a community-based day hab to that person the other days. So I would be really thinking of how to do that and weaving together, again, the totality of services for that person in the day. Byron, just to check, am I back on? You see my screen again?
I do see your screen. I see a brown box, but I see your screen, yes.
Okay, let me see if I can just cut that. Oops. I don't know what happened, but did I move it?
It's moved some,
okay.
Yes, you did.
Okay. Sorry, folks. For some reason, my computer just decided to die. So we have to be able, to be flexible and be thoughtful. We have to, the challenge I think we have is to maintain our capacity and at the same time make sure that we have adequate referrals and services for which we can bill, and have to be really thoughtful about trimming what may be unneeded expenses. Sometimes there's something you've been doing forever, like you've had a person in a particular role forever and a day, and now you're changing the way you're doing it, or doing services, and you still maintain that person or that position, but you don't actually really need it anymore in the same way. That's what I'm talking about. What do we have in terms of resources? How are we using them? And as things are changing, are we changing how we're allocating those resources? So basically, the way that you make a plan for appropriate resource reallocation or allocation is, as I said before, think about that plan that you're developing, identify the type and amount of resources that you need based on that timeline, and based on that timeline, determine when you'll need them. That then helps you know when you need what and how you're going to need to get them online at the right time. So where you're probably going to find yourself for a while here is where most of us find ourselves at some point during transformation, and that is you're making an assessment of what you have currently in terms of resources, an assessment of what you're going to need in the future, and there's going to be a gap there. And the gap comes from the fact that you're still providing a lot of the old services. So you're drawing some of the resources off to continue the old service. So during the period of time that you are transforming, you're often pulling hard on your resources and, in fact, perhaps exhausting those. There was a day, and I'm old enough to recall, when we used to get things like bridge funding, when we were making changes like this. Those days are gone, and so that money is usually no longer available from government. There are things that help you, like, for example, the projects that you're currently participating in, which I hope is helping you, but in terms of just getting big chunks of change that are going to help you through a transitional time, that's just not realistic anymore. So that's why I often talk a great deal about the importance of private fundraising for agencies. That only works if you're a not-for-profit. Obviously, you can't raise funds for your agency, certainly not and give tax credits if you are a for-profit company. In a for-profit situation, that's more of what your investors can afford to put on the table. But for not-for-profits like yours and most of yours and like my agency, fundraising, particularly during these times of change, became absolutely imperative. That's why, some of you will recall, when you were doing the self-assessment, there's a whole section there that talks about whether you raise funds, whether you have designated staff to help you raise funds, or whether you plan on securing such a person, or at least the services of such a person. Because you don't always have to have a development person to raise money. One of the providers I've been working with there in Alabama has a board that's very interested in raising money. That's a very appropriate role for your boards of directors. And so there's lots of different ways to raise money. I know in our agency we did all of these things that you see on the left side of this page. Individual giving, which is just, an individual person or family giving money. Planned giving, which is what people do if they anticipate that they would like to make the agency a beneficiary of some of their estate upon their death. Events are good, but they're tricky. You can lose a lot of money in an event, so they have to be done thoughtfully. And then grants are very important in helping you make these transitions. For example, and I've probably shared this before, our agency raised money for our electronic database system, and we raised it in 3 segments: one for hardware, one for the software licensing, and another a bunch of money for the training. So it's really, and that came from us having a plan, knowing what we were going to do, knowing what we needed, knowing when we needed it, and raising money to match that schedule. So it can be done. So reallocating resources is really about placing your resources where your emphasis should be, in this case, community integrated employment. But it's also about using your resources much more efficiently, and it's about being creative. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all of those things. So what should you consider as you're looking at this whole concept of resource reallocation? Well, your efficiency is the number one thing. And you're all going to say, because I would certainly say it too, you can't get blood out of a stone, and you're about as efficient as you can be. But there's always a way to get a little bit more efficient, and I'll talk to you about some ways that we used in our agency. One of the first things that we looked at to reduce costs were our administrative services. And, this is where technology, I think, really comes in and helps us a lot now, and that we need to be using it to the max. Our agency, almost immediately, as we were transitioning to the community, started looking at the way we were doing timesheets. We were doing them manually. It was very difficult. They were being run all over the place, trying to get them, to the right person, and was it done correctly, and on and on and on. Because we became so community-based, we went to telephonic timekeeping, which means all you need is a telephone and the 800 number and the code, and no matter where you are, you can call in and check in and punch in for the day or punch out. That was enormously helpful for us. It really cut out a lot of the running back and forth. It cut out a lot of managers' time, because everything then got calculated within the electronic system, which automatically went over to payroll. So I can't imagine how many man hours we saved just by that simple transition over to the telephonic timekeeping. As I said, our payroll became much more electronically driven, and as did our entire accounting system became more electronically driven, and we developed more and more capability within those electronic systems for managers to be able to drill down on financial information and get more detail quickly. So if I had an expense report and there was an item on there that I didn't understand, we had a system where you could click on that item and it would give you the detail. That meant that managers then could be more self-managing. They didn't have to run to the CFO or accounting or whatever to ask questions all the time. They could do more of the work themselves of understanding what was going on. So all three of those things I just mentioned were things that electronics cut the manpower drastically by adopting those things. Same thing became true with our benefits management and some other information for employees, in that we, on our website, developed a portal that was made available to staff, and they could go in, and if they had an address change or something, they changed that themselves, rather than going to somebody at HR, handing them a piece of paper or sending them an email with a new address, and then making the HR person go into the system and do it. Is much more efficient when it was able, not, and hear me, not everything can be done that way, but there's a number of things that could be done that way by staff, thereby cutting down on HR staff. Our agency pretty much was stripped of all clerical support. There were very few people in any kind of clerical positions, and those that were in clerical positions were multi-talented. They did things like reimbursement, small reimbursements, supported some of the timekeeping, supported some of the light HR recruitment activities. So we reduced that clerical support and increased the electronic capabilities of our system and the skills of our staff. So instead of needing someone to do something for me, I never would have dreamt of that. Did all of my own work. All of the supervisors did, the senior managers did, the CEO did their own work, learned how to get around having to have anybody else do stuff for you. And because we became so electronically oriented, we were able to reduce office costs too, because more people could work remotely. So if somebody could work from home and do, their piece of the payroll or their piece of the billing or whatever, they didn't need an office. So we could have floating offices and people not required to come in so much. So if you just look at that and think of those reductions in personnel and space, et cetera, you can begin to see how we started looking at reallocating those dollars that went to that to new things. I didn't know I had those under here. Okay. So I spoke to this a little before, but let me go back to this for a minute. This is where we're all moving. We have been in a highly centralized service delivery system. And what I mean by that is all of the people, all of the staff came generally to one location or one or two locations, and that's where they stayed all day. And all of the resources were harbored in those one or two locations because that's where the customers were. Well, this schematic is more like where we're going to be in the future, or where we're already headed, some of us. And that is, the customers are going to be less inclined to come to a central place. They're going to be more inclined to stay in their home communities or in the community somewhere to receive services. It also means that the staff are going to be less inclined to come to a centralized place. They're going to be more inclined to be themselves out in the community because that's where the customers are. So if we have historically aggregated all of our resources in the center, in the facilities, and now indeed the business and the staff are out in the community, it should be clear how we're going to have to shift some of those resources to those new locations. So in decentralization, you have community integrated jobs, and you have community-based wraparound supports. Those things are in the community. You have staff that are untethered from the facility. And in my agency, staff very rarely came to the facility. We didn't have a facility, but rarely came even to an office. They met people in the community. They did things in the community, and then they went home from the community. They were electronically connected. So at the end of the day, if they needed to do their notes or their data or whatever, they just sat down wherever they were, or they went home with their device. As long as they could get an internet connection, they could do their data at the end of the day. There was no requirement for them to come back to the office. Hence, there was no cost for travel. There's no cost for maintaining that space. It very much was reallocating space and different things that we had for the staff away from the facility and into the community where they could use it. Transportation, also changed for us because we were not constantly transporting people from various places in the community to that singular location, that facility. Often people were staying very close to home to work or to participate in their home community. So the cost of transportation and the distances of transportation changed, and that minimized the travel. So again, in some localities, like in the big cities, we got rid of all vehicles and only used public transportation. In the rural areas, we did have vehicles, but people worked and participated in the community closer to home, so we weren't running miles and miles and miles every day, spending a lot of money in transportation and gas and staff time. In terms of management, everything has to go on the table. And what I mean by that is all positions have to be scrutinized for whether do we really still need this and what value does this position have. There really can't be sacred cows, meaning positions or people who can't be touched, because this, if you're providing services in a different way and in different environments, you may be structured differently in order to make that work as compared to how you were structured for almost exclusively facility-based work. So you can't assume that there's a one-for-one transition of everyone into the new framework. There may be, and we hope most people will have a new position or an expanded position, but don't take that for granted. Everything has to be looked at and evaluated. In terms of people's duties, job descriptions have to be rewritten, and that has a significant impact on some of the staff. Managers need to know that they have a new expectation for increased support to staff in the community. And because the managers are so often in the community, it may have some implications for what they may need in terms of hardware, software, communication, connectivity, other kinds of capabilities. But it also may have some implications for what they do not need, perhaps in terms of permanent office space and some other things. In terms of the organization, something to think about, and it's very important, is that often when in community-based work, we see a flattening of the organization. And what I mean by that is the management flattens out some. And the way that that's often accomplished is by having more teams in the community. So in an organization like mine, just take an example in rural Tennessee, where we might have been in one county, that county became a team, and it was more of a self-directed team and didn't require as much management intervention. A whole new way of doing things, but again, that would allow us to flatten the organization, redirect some salary dollars from some management positions that we perhaps no longer needed into other needed things. So there are important shifts that you're going to need to evaluate and potentially make. In terms of staff, just by the same token, I said that at management, every position needs to be scrutinized. That's true for all positions. We need to spend our time or some time determining what qualities and characteristics that we need in staff, and at the same time determining what the duties are, rewriting those job descriptions, and including in there a new expectation for increased self-management. In a facility, you may see a staff person every day. If they're in the community most of the time, you may not see them as a manager. That means that staff is going to do more self-management. That may have implications. Well, it has many implications, but one of those is for management and the flattening of the organization, as I mentioned before. In terms of skills, you're going to have to look very carefully at those ratios, which I noted before, and we're going to have staff that are very talented and able to make very good job matches, because that's not something we've done as well as we could have in the past, and customized employment is helping with us. But we also are going to need staff who are able to develop natural supports. So indeed, we can do some of the fading that we're going to need to do in order to stay financially sound. So there are many, many, many things to take a look at, and many of them are personnel related, but some of them are capital resource related. So in agencies that have been oriented towards production and in-house work, there are some things that have to be looked at there too, particularly if you're scaling that work down. One of the things is looking around and saying, what do I have here in terms of equipment that I used to use, but we're not using that anymore? Is that something that we can sell or otherwise get rid of? It's taking up space, it's not being productive, we've got to get rid of it. It may be, and this is not universally true, that in some circumstances, because you will increase reliance on public transportation, you can end up with some extra vehicles. Also in decentralization, that is also possible. Correspondingly, it's possible that you'll have to add them. So that's not always a sure thing, but it is something to take a look at. I work with lots of people who live in cities that have good public transportation that they don't use. And it's just because they're not accustomed to using it. But if they used it in lieu of using vehicles that they own or lease, they would do much better financially, and people would have a better opportunity to gain skills and be more independent with travel. As I mentioned before, you can end up and have to look at your organization for excess office or facility space. I talked about office space before, but facility space is important too. Work with many, many, many agencies who have, some of whom have gotten in a position where they can do away with their facilities. Many more have just reduced the size of their facilities, maybe leasing out parts of them, or selling those facilities and moving into smaller storefront types of situations where they're in town, wherever it is they happen to be located, and have better access to amenities that will be available for the individuals. So, and you do have many more people working in the community, many more staff, and also working downsized administrations. It is often very possible to do this. I will tell you, it is one of the things that upsets people the most to even have discussions about. So it's not the first thing you have to look at, but it is something to look at as you are seeing that you may be using your buildings less, and yet you're still paying for them. In my own agency, there came a day that we looked around and there were so few people in the building, and we were spending a fortune on mortgage and lights and water and parking and all of that, and realized this was a shoe that we could drop if we just carefully planned how to move forward. And then all of that money that we no longer spent on those things were the dollars that we reallocated towards things that we really needed, like the electronic database system, like the additional staff, like the more highly trained staff, things that made sense in the brave new world for us, not so much in the old way of doing things. If your agency has affirmative enterprises, there are some things to think about with those. I have worked with a number of agencies with affirmative enterprises who did not realize until they did a careful analysis that in fact they were losing money on those enterprises. And that is something I'm sure that nobody wants to do. And there's, some things to bear in mind. For example, in one of the states in which I work, they have really started looking at the affirmative enterprises, and if they see, this is government, if they see $1 of Medicaid money being spent on a supervisor for the business, they will take that dollar away from you. That money is meant to provide the service to the individual. It can't be used to support the business. So if people evaluate those affirmative businesses using multiple variables, including extracting those government funds from the operations, for example, sometimes they will see this isn't nearly as profitable as I thought it was, and I need to do something different. A thing to also evaluate if you're using an affirmative business is it achieving the targeted outcome? So if no one is leaving that affirmative business to get a job in the community, then that's telling me it's not being very effective in getting the ultimate outcome we're going for, which is the community integrated employment. And if it takes somebody, 10 years of working in that affirmative business to eventually get a job, it may be that we're spending so much more money in having that person be trained in that business that we're operating that it isn't cost effective. So I encourage people who have affirmative businesses to look very carefully and make sure you aren't accidentally flushing cash through those businesses rather than achieving the goals you think you want to achieve. And then a very important question to ask about the affirmative businesses is this business going to be marketable in the future, or are the skills that we are assuming that people are learning within that affirmative business going to be marketable in the future? And if that's not the case, then I would certainly question why you would continue that. And then just the sheer notion of operating that affirmative business, does that comport with where you want to go in the future? I work with an agency, and I won't even say what state it's in, but they raise $400,000 a year to run an affirmative business, which ostensibly trains people to go and get jobs in the community. Well, if I had that $400,000, I'd hire some crackerjack job developers, or improve some other my staffing ratios. I would do other things with $400,000 than to prop up a business that I'm running ostensibly for the purpose of training people, and no one actually is getting trained and going into a job from that business. We can't afford to do those kinds of things anymore. That is just not a good use of our resources. One thing that I think is very important for folks to think about, too, is the whole concept of diversification. If you've got all your eggs in one basket, as this illustration shows, that is very risky. So some of you on the phone or not on the phone who may hear this later but are involved in the project, don't, for example, have ADRS contracts or VR dollars. You've got some Medicaid dollars, but you don't have VR dollars. You're talking about all of your eggs are in one basket. I wouldn't do that. I would be very conscious of assessing what your core competencies are. If you're great at getting people jobs, then by all means get those contracts with VR. Be willing to serve different populations of people that they may have. Do like I did in my agency. I began to look at some welfare to work populations, people who needed to get into jobs but they needed skilled people to help them do that. You can also evaluate partnerships with other agencies, and this is something, listen closely to this because I think this is important. I'm seeing more and more agencies, particularly those who are smaller and then some who are larger, who are joining up together, and those smaller agencies are purchasing some administrative services from the larger agencies who have the capability, excess capability. So you might have a small agency that no longer does its own payroll. They contract that out to a bigger agency in their area. And that's helpful to both entities because you're cutting your costs as the smaller entity and you're making some money off your excess capacity as the larger agency. So be thoughtful about what is it that you're spending money on, that you're having to spend a good deal of money on, that you would not, or you could spend much less on if you partnered with someone. So, to summarize all of this, our business is, we're changing. It's beyond debate. This is no longer a debate. It is a reality. And that changes toward community integrated employment and also meaningful community involvement for the people that we support. And we only have, just so many resources. And, and anybody on this phone would tell me right now, we all fight all the time for money because it is just a challenge for the states and for government to cover all of the expenses that they have coming at them. And it's, probably not going to be true that we get big bushels of money coming our way sometime in the future. So, we really have to look at the amount of resources we have, look at the future of our agency, and figure out how we're going to make that transition and how we're going to use the current resources differently in the future. Because something has to give, and you have to, even if you think you're that bloodless stone, figure out how to become more efficient and identify some additional resources as well. You want to use your current resources well, and you want to seek additional resources. And all of this is hard work, but, it can be done. But this is why when Tom and I talk to you about the difficulty of transformation, we can't be emphatic enough. Transformation means not just, doodling around the edges. It's pulling the guts out of your organization and restructuring it so that it can serve people in the way they want to be served in the future. And that's in integrated work, that's in meaningful activities in the community. So you have to get your priorities clear. You have to have no sacred cows. You have to be willing to make some tough decisions. But if you do all that, I believe you can move very successfully into the future. So with that, I am almost right on time, Byron, for concluding. And if there are any questions, happy to take them.
Okay, there's no question in the chat box. Does anyone have any questions on the phone?